Fame convinces us that talent equals intelligence. History says otherwise. Tonight we're looking at 17 British stars who dazzled audiences, dominated screens, and somehow made decisions so baffling they left contemporaries stunned. Not untalented, not unskilled, but spectacularly, persistently foolish in ways that damaged careers, hollowed legacies, and rewrote destinies. These aren't scandals for shock value, they're cautionary tales hiding in plain sight. Because brilliance doesn't protect you from bad judgment. Sometimes it just gives it a louder microphone. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of slow-burn history you enjoy, consider subscribing. It's how these long nights of storytelling keep going. And while you're listening, drop a comment and tell us where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. These stories land differently depending on the hour. 1. Michael Caine. Michael Caine has spent the better part of a century perfecting the image of the sharp-eyed Cockney intellectual. The man who looks like he knows exactly what's going on, even when he's saying very little. He speaks with the calm authority of someone who has seen things, survived things, and learned from them. And that's precisely why the most baffling thing about Michael Caine is how often he cheerfully admits that he didn't learn a thing. By his own repeated confession, Caine accepted roles the way other people accept flyers on the street, quickly, casually, and without reading the fine print. He has said, more than once, that he took jobs purely because the check looked healthy, even when it was painfully obvious the film itself would be roasted alive on release. Not quietly, not privately, publicly, with a grin, as if admitting to professional negligence were just another charming anecdote to roll out on a chat show sofa. The most famous examples are so notorious they've become punchlines. Films that critics lined up to dismantle, scripts that seemed to have been written during a lunch break, projects that collapsed under their own absurdity. And Caine? He shrugged. He explained that a bad film still paid for a very nice house. He insisted that audiences were unpredictable, that his instincts were usually right. They weren't. Not consistently, not even close. What makes this so astonishing isn't greed. Hollywood is built on that, but the blind confidence. Caine wasn't a desperate actor scrambling for relevance. He was a respected, bankable star with leverage. He could have demanded rewrites, declined nonsense, protected his legacy. Instead, he outsourced judgment entirely to his accountant and trusted that everything would work itself out in the edit. It rarely did. Critics mocked him. Fans winced. Yet Caine seemed genuinely puzzled by the backlash. In his mind, the equation was simple. Work equals money. Money equals freedom. Reputation apparently was optional. And while his later career redemption proved that audiences were willing to forgive, the pattern remains extraordinary. An intelligent man repeatedly underestimating how foolish he looked by treating his craft like a vending machine. Caine's honesty saves him from outright condemnation, but it also locks the verdict in place. This wasn't ignorance. It was willful dismissal of consequence, dressed up as pragmatism. And it raises an uncomfortable question that hangs in the air. If this is what foolishness looks like when it smiles and counts its money, what happens when it hides behind silence, rigidity, and principle instead? Because one of his contemporaries did exactly that, and paid a far stranger price. 2. Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde had the face of a matinee idol and the mind of a novelist, which made his particular brand of foolishness harder to spot at first. Unlike Michael Caine's open indifference to judgment, Bogarde's mistakes were wrapped in seriousness, discipline, and a kind of icy moral pride. He wasn't careless. He was inflexible. And that rigidity quietly dismantled a career that should have been untouchable. Bogarde lived in an industry built on compromise and chose absolutism instead. At a time when studios expected stars to perform carefully constructed versions of themselves, he refused. He guarded his private life with near militaristic severity, declining roles, dodging publicity, and freezing out powerful allies, rather than making even minor accommodations to how the system worked. This wasn't courage in the face of oppression. It was stubbornness, masquerading as integrity. The consequences were immediate and well documented. Studios lost patience. Projects evaporated. Invitations stopped coming, while others in similar positions adapted, quietly, pragmatically, imperfectly. Bogarde doubled down. He believed that maintaining total control was worth any professional cost. The trouble was that the cost wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. Lost influence. Lost momentum. Lost relevance. What makes this so baffling is that Bogarde was acutely intelligent. He understood subtext. He grasped symbolism. He could dissect human hypocrisy with surgical precision on screen. Yet off-screen, he clung to an all-or-nothing worldview that left no room for strategic thinking. He treated every concession as a betrayal, and every suggestion as an insult. The result was a career that narrowed rather than expanded, not because the audience rejected him, but because he refused to meet them halfway. Biographers and contemporaries describe a man who mistook control for safety. By locking everything down, he believed he was protecting himself. In reality, he was isolating himself. Power in the film industry is rarely seized through withdrawal. It's negotiated, traded, and sometimes endured. Bogarde rejected that reality outright, and then seemed surprised when the machine rolled on without him. There's something quietly tragic about it. No scandals, no spectacular implosions, just a slow, deliberate constriction brought on by an inability to bend. And it invites a darker thought. Sometimes foolishness doesn't look loud or chaotic. Sometimes it looks dignified, principled, and deeply convinced of its own righteousness. And if rigid intelligence can undo a man like that, imagine what happens when brilliance collides with something far softer, far more trusting, and optimism so open it believes the unseen is reaching back. Before the next story unfolds, take a quiet second. If you're enjoying this slow descent through fame and folly, consider subscribing so you don't miss the ones still ahead. And while you're here, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. These stories always feel different depending on the hour. 3. Margaret Rutherford. Margaret Rutherford radiated warmth, eccentricity, and a kind of joyful authority that made audiences feel safe in her presence. She didn't just play comforting characters. She embodied comfort itself, which is precisely why her most astonishing flaw went largely unchallenged for far too long. Rutherford believed, not metaphorically, literally. Well into the post-war years, at a time when Britain was rebuilding itself on science, reason, and skepticism, Rutherford placed unwavering faith in spiritualists, seances, and unseen guides who claimed to know her future. This wasn't a passing curiosity or a theatrical indulgence. She made genuine decisions, financial, emotional, personal, based on what these figures told her from across a table lit by candles and conviction. Friends worried. Colleagues whispered. Biographers later confirmed what many suspected. She was deeply, almost heartbreakingly credulous. Money flowed out of her accounts toward people, promising insight from beyond the visible world. Advice was taken at face value, no matter how implausible. And all of this happened while she was navigating an industry that required shrewdness, negotiation, and constant vigilance. What makes Rutherford's foolishness so striking is its timing. This wasn't the Victorian era. This was mid-20th century Britain. Ration books, rebuilding, radio debates, and a public increasingly allergic to mysticism dressed up as certainty. Even then, her beliefs stood out as anachronistic. Gentle, yes. Harmless in intent, perhaps, but undeniably naive. There is no malice here, no arrogance, just a powerful talent paired with an almost childlike trust that the universe was personally invested in guiding her. And that trust made her vulnerable to exploitation, to disappointment, and to decisions made on faith rather than evidence. The irony is painful. A woman celebrated for her sharpness on screen, quietly surrendering agency off it. Yet audiences adored her, which raises an unsettling contradiction. We often assume warmth equals wisdom, that kindness implies discernment. Rutherford proves otherwise. She reminds us that intelligence in one domain does not immunize against folly in another, and that belief, when left unchecked, can be just as damaging as cynicism. And if gullibility can hide behind charm and laughter, the next story suggests something even stranger. A man of razor-sharp intellect who fully understood his mistakes and made them anyway. 4. John Hurt. John Hurt built a career on fragility, intelligence, and emotional precision. He specialized in characters who seemed painfully aware of the world's cruelty, men who understood consequences before they arrived, which makes the recurring pattern of his own life so perplexing. Again and again, Hurt walked straight into situations he later described as obviously disastrous, as if self-awareness stopped working the moment it was needed most. Hurt openly acknowledged that many of his most damaging personal decisions were impulsive. Not romantic in the cinematic sense, but hurried, ill-considered, and rooted in an optimism he later called absurdly naive. Relationships were entered with conviction and exited with regret. Financial arrangements were made on trust rather than caution. Warnings were heard, understood, and then politely ignored. This wasn't recklessness fueled by ego. It was something stranger, a belief that insight alone would somehow neutralize consequences. What makes this stand out is the contrast between Hurt the artist and Hurt the decision-maker. On screen, he dissected power, cruelty, and self-deception with surgical calm. He understood how people trap themselves. Off-screen, he repeated the same cycles with almost academic consistency. Interviews later in life carry a tone of quiet disbelief, as if he were reviewing the case of someone else entirely. He knew better. He just didn't act better. Unlike louder self-saboteurs, Hurt didn't implode publicly. The damage was slower, more private, but no less real. Stress compounded. Stability evaporated. He spoke candidly about how these choices drained energy and focus, even as his reputation for seriousness remained intact. That duality, wisdom without discipline, left many contemporaries baffled. Intelligence, it turns out, does not automatically confer judgment. There's something deeply human in this, but also deeply frustrating. Hurt represents a particular kind of foolishness. The belief that understanding a problem is the same as solving it. It isn't. Insight without restraint is just observation. And over time, the cost of that confusion accumulates quietly, eroding foundations rather than shattering them. His story lingers because it feels uncomfortably familiar. How many people recognize their own mistakes perfectly and repeat them anyway? And if emotional intelligence can fail so completely, what happens when intellectual arrogance enters the picture? Because the next figure didn't just misunderstand his audience, he dismissed them outright. 5. Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness was many things: disciplined, cerebral, precise, and devastatingly skilled. What he was not, by his own admission, was interested in understanding the people who adored him most, and that disinterest curdled into something resembling contempt, producing one of the most puzzling cases of cultural foolishness in British acting history. Guinness prided himself on seriousness. Theatre, literature, restraint, these were the measures by which he judged value. Popular entertainment, by contrast, irritated him. When a certain space-themed film transformed him into a global icon and secured his financial future beyond any reasonable doubt, his reaction was not gratitude but thinly veiled disdain. He dismissed the dialogue as childish, the fans as tiresome, and the phenomenon as beneath consideration. This wasn't a private irritation. He wrote about it, repeatedly. He complained about audiences who quoted lines back to him, about letters from young fans, about the very role that allowed him unprecedented freedom to choose future projects. The irony is almost theatrical. A man benefiting enormously from mass appeal while resenting the masses themselves. Why this qualifies as foolishness isn't snobbery alone. It's the misreading of leverage. Guinness believed cultural hierarchy was fixed. High art above, popular art below. What he failed to grasp was that the audience, not the critic, now held the power. His refusal to engage didn't make him noble. It made him sound ungrateful and increasingly out of step, even as he continued cashing the rewards. Colleagues noticed. Fans noticed. The warmth that might have surrounded his later career cooled into distance. He didn't lose his status, but he lost something harder to quantify: goodwill. And all of it stemmed from an inability, or refusal, to accept that accessibility and intelligence are not opposites. Guinness wasn't wrong to value depth. He was wrong to believe disdain was the price of it. That confusion left a faintly sour aftertaste on an otherwise immaculate career. And it raises a further question. If contempt for popularity can blind a man to his own fortune, what happens when someone doesn't even understand the fortune they're losing? Because the next star didn't sneer at money. He simply never learned how it worked. 6. James Mason. James Mason possessed one of the most commanding voices in cinema, measured, hypnotic, effortlessly authoritative. When he spoke, he sounded like a man who had everything under control. In reality, Mason drifted through his financial life with an almost astonishing lack of comprehension, as if practical matters were an optional subplot best left unresolved. Mason openly admitted that he didn't understand money, not in a self-deprecating, charming way, but in a literal, consequential sense. Contracts were signed without scrutiny. Obligations were misunderstood or ignored. Assumptions were made that problems would resolve themselves because they always had before. They didn't. The results were severe enough to dictate where he lived, what work he accepted, and how his later career unfolded. What makes this so striking is that Mason wasn't careless by nature. He was thoughtful, political, and articulate. He had navigated ideological minefields with caution and intent. Yet when it came to finances, the scaffolding that supports artistic freedom, he seemed almost willfully disengaged. Advisors were brushed aside. Warnings went unheeded. Complexity was treated as an inconvenience rather than a necessity. The consequences forced him into decisions he resented. Roles taken not out of interest but obligation. Moves made not for opportunity but necessity. Mason himself acknowledged the irony. A man capable of portraying control undone by a refusal to learn the basics of his own profession's economics. It wasn't exploitation. It was ignorance, sustained long after it stopped being excusable. Contemporaries were baffled. This was not a young actor learning the ropes. This was an established star repeating the same errors, convinced that intellect in one area should compensate for neglect in another. It never does. Money, unlike reputation, does not respect talent. Mason's story underscores a recurring pattern. Brilliance paired with blind spots large enough to steer entire lives off course. And as the list moves forward, those blind spots stop being quiet or polite. They grow louder, messier, and harder to excuse, until self-destruction stops being accidental and starts looking almost deliberate. 7. Donald Pleasence. Donald Pleasence had one of the most distinctive presences in British cinema. The intense stare, the compressed posture, the voice that sounded permanently on the edge of revelation or menace. Directors loved him because he brought gravity to anything, and Pleasence, in return, brought himself to almost everything. That, ultimately, was the problem. Pleasence developed a reputation for saying yes, not selectively, not strategically, but reflexively. Prestige projects, low-budget thrillers, half-formed genre experiments, incoherent international co-productions. It didn't seem to matter. If there was a role, he took it. If there was a script, he trusted it. If there wasn't much of either, he showed up anyway. The sheer volume of his output became staggering, and not in a flattering way. At first, this looked like professionalism. an actor who worked, an actor who respected employment. But over time, something else emerged: dilution. His once formidable reputation for quality became blurred by association with projects that were, at best, confused, and at worst, barely functional. Critics noticed. Audiences noticed. Industry insiders joked about it. Pleasence became a punchline, not because he was bad, but because he was everywhere. What makes this foolish rather than merely unfortunate is that Pleasence was aware of it. Interviews from later years reveal a man who understood that his career had become cluttered. He acknowledged that not everything he did was worth doing. And yet he continued. Some cite financial anxiety. Others point to restlessness. But neither fully explains the persistence. Plenty of actors slowed down. Pleasence accelerated. The tragedy isn't that he worked too much, it's that he worked without discrimination. By accepting everything, he unintentionally flattened the impact of his best performances. When greatness becomes routine, it stops feeling great. His talent didn't disappear, it was buried under repetition. Pleasence's story is a warning disguised as diligence. Saying yes can look like humility. It can also look like avoidance, of reflection, of restraint, of the harder choice to wait. And if overexposure can quietly erode a legacy, the next figure shows what happens when excess isn't quiet at all, but emotional, chaotic, and entirely unchecked. 8. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers didn't just play characters. He dissolved into them. Accents, gestures, psychology, rhythm. He absorbed identities so completely that even collaborators struggled to locate the person underneath. That brilliance made him indispensable. It also made him unstable. And Sellers, tragically, mistook instability for depth. Sellers' foolishness wasn't a single habit or flaw. It was a constellation. He lurched from relationship to relationship with breathtaking speed, convinced each new attachment would finally stabilize him. It never did. He embraced fringe psychological ideas with the enthusiasm of a convert, surrendering autonomy to theories and advisors who promised clarity and delivered confusion. Decisions were made impulsively, then defended as necessity. Professional relationships suffered accordingly. Directors who had once championed him found him impossible to manage. Collaborations collapsed under the weight of unpredictability. He would arrive inspired one day, unreachable the next. Boundaries dissolved, accountability evaporated, and through it all, Sellers seemed genuinely baffled that people grew wary. What makes this so frustrating is that Sellers was not unaware. He spoke openly about feeling hollow, about not knowing who he was without a role. But instead of addressing that core problem, he chased distractions, new identities, new fixes, new emotional upheavals. Insight became an excuse rather than a solution. "This is just how I am" replaced, "This needs to change." Colleagues described exhaustion, not anger, fatigue. Working with Sellers meant brilliance paired with constant damage control. Over time, patience thinned, opportunities narrowed. The same qualities that made him extraordinary made him unreliable. And in an industry that runs on trust, unreliability is fatal. Sellers' story isn't about eccentricity. It's about indulgence. The indulgence of believing that genius excuses everything else. It doesn't. Talent can open doors, but behavior decides whether they stay open. And when they start to close, the fall is rarely graceful. If Sellers shows what happens when a man loses himself entirely, the next figure offers a colder, darker variation, someone who knew exactly who he was, and decided it all meant very little. 9. George Sanders. George Sanders made a career out of disdain. His voice dripped with it. His posture suggested it. On screen, he perfected the art of elegant contempt, delivering lines as if the very act of speaking to others were a personal inconvenience. Audiences loved him for it. The trouble is, that persona didn't end when the cameras stopped. Sanders cultivated cynicism as a philosophy, not just a performance tool. He spoke openly about his boredom with life, his irritation with people, and his belief that most effort was pointless. At first, this came across as world-weary sophistication. Over time, it hardened into something more alarming, a rigid worldview that left no room for curiosity, growth, or reconsideration. What makes this foolishness, rather than mere pessimism, is how performative it became. Sanders didn't just feel detached, he broadcast it. Interviews were laced with provocation. Statements were crafted to shock rather than illuminate. He seemed to relish the idea of being misunderstood, mistaking alienation for superiority. Contemporaries noted that his bitterness often felt rehearsed, as if contempt itself were a role he refused to stop playing. This posture narrowed his world. Relationships thinned. Engagement with work became mechanical. When dissatisfaction deepened, Sanders responded not with adjustment, but with escalation, doubling down on the idea that detachment was proof of intelligence. It wasn't. It was surrender disguised as insight. The end of his story was treated by many observers not as a shock, but as a grimly consistent conclusion to a life spent insisting nothing mattered very much. That reaction alone says everything. When cynicism becomes identity, even extreme outcomes lose their weight. Sanders leaves behind an uncomfortable lesson. Irony can rot into emptiness if it's never challenged. Detachment can curdle into isolation. And when contempt replaces curiosity, there's nowhere left to go. From here, the pattern shifts again, away from cold dismissal and toward overwhelming force. Because the next figure didn't withdraw from life. He dominated it, emotionally and artistically, while remaining astonishingly blind to the damage left in his wake. 10. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier is often spoken of in superlatives so large they feel untouchable. Titan. Genius. Benchmark. He dominated British acting for decades with a confidence that bordered on inevitability. On stage, he seemed to understand human motivation at a cellular level. Offstage, however, he demonstrated a startling inability, or refusal, to recognize the emotional realities of the people closest to him. Olivier's foolishness was not rooted in ignorance but in emotional blindness. He could analyze a character's pain with microscopic precision while dismissing real pain as inconvenience. Letters, biographies, and contemporaries paint a consistent picture. A man who assumed his perspective was the correct one, and that disagreement was either weakness or misunderstanding. This extended deeply into his personal relationships, where charm and authority substituted for empathy. What makes this so astonishing is that Olivier wasn't cruel in a theatrical sense. He didn't lash out impulsively or sabotage himself publicly. Instead, he minimized. He denied. He reframed situations to preserve his own comfort. When confronted with emotional complexity, particularly that of others, he often chose not to engage. He believed discipline could replace understanding. It can't. Colleagues described him as generous and tyrannical in equal measure, supportive when aligned with his vision, dismissive when challenged. This rigidity left damage in its wake, not through explosive conflict, but through sustained invalidation. People close to him felt unseen, unheard, and ultimately expendable in service of the work. Olivier's intelligence makes this foolishness sharper, not softer. He understood psychology. He simply didn't apply it inward or outward when it threatened his self-image. The irony is stark. A man who portrayed moral struggle with breathtaking nuance struggled to acknowledge it when it arrived uninvited. His legacy survives intact, but it carries an asterisk, one that whispers rather than shouts. Greatness does not absolve emotional negligence, and if unchecked authority can distort even the sharpest mind, the next figure shows what happens when brilliance collides with compulsion, repeatedly and in full view of the world. 11. Richard Burton. Richard Burton didn't lack insight. He lacked restraint. Few actors spoke as eloquently about their own weaknesses while doing so little to change them. Burton was painfully aware of the damage his habits caused, professionally, physically, emotionally, and yet he marched toward it with almost scholarly determination. From early on, warnings were plentiful: medical, professional, personal. He acknowledged them all. In interviews, he spoke with brutal clarity about his excesses, even predicting their consequences. And then, almost on cue, he ignored his own conclusions. This wasn't denial. It was defiance. Burton's foolishness lay in his romanticization of self-destruction. He treated excess as proof of authenticity, suffering as evidence of depth. Discipline, by contrast, felt artificial, something imposed rather than earned. This mindset turned warning signs into challenges and advice into noise. The more the world urged moderation, the more he leaned into the storm. The cost was cumulative. Projects collapsed. Reputations frayed. Public sympathy wore thin. What began as tolerance hardened into resignation. People stopped intervening, not because they didn't care, but because intervention had proven futile. Burton became a man everyone understood and no one could help. What's most unsettling is how transparent it all was. There were no secrets, no mysteries, just repetition. Burton seemed trapped in a loop where awareness fed indulgence rather than restraint. Insight became part of the performance, a tragic monologue delivered again and again with no intention of changing the ending. His story lingers because it challenges a comforting myth, that self-knowledge leads to self-control. It doesn't. Sometimes it only sharpens the blade. And if open self-destruction can be framed as honesty, the next figure complicates things further. A man who rejected the very idea of the path laid before him, even when it offered everything. 12. Albert Finney. Albert Finney was admired for his ferocity, his unpredictability, and his refusal to play the game. He stood apart in an industry built on ambition, and for a while, that stance looked principled. Then the pattern emerged. Opportunity after opportunity arrived, and Finney swatted them away with stubborn consistency. The most famous rejection looms large. Career-defining roles declined not for creative reasons, but out of reflexive contrarianism. Finney bristled at the idea of being shaped, branded, or elevated into something expected. He mistook resistance for independence, assuming that refusing obvious success was a form of integrity. It wasn't always. Peers were baffled. Agents were exasperated. These weren't compromises that threatened his identity. They were doors. And Finney didn't just close them. He locked them and insisted the room was better without windows. Over time, this posture narrowed his range of options, even as his talent remained unquestioned. What makes this foolish rather than admirable is the lack of alternative strategy. Finney didn't replace rejected opportunities with equally powerful ones. He simply opted out, trusting that work would continue on his terms indefinitely. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. The industry moves forward regardless of principle. Finney's choices didn't ruin him, but they constrained him. He became a figure of what might have been, rather than what fully was. His resistance hardened into habit, and habit into limitation. Independence without foresight becomes isolation. His story sits at an inflection point in this list. From here on, the consequences stop being subtle. The margins for error shrink. Stubbornness becomes self-sabotage. And control, whether seized or rejected, begins to slip entirely out of reach. Because the next figure didn't turn down power. He had it. And then, astonishingly, he burned through it faster than anyone thought possible. 13. Stanley Baker. Stanley Baker fought his way up from nothing with a ferocity that terrified and impressed everyone around him. He was not born into comfort, nor did he coast on charm. He seized control of roles, of productions, of entire projects, with the urgency of someone who knew exactly how rare power was. And then, almost inexplicably, he treated that power as if it were indestructible. Baker didn't just star in major films, he produced them. He negotiated authority that most actors only dreamed of. For a brief window, he stood at the center of British cinema with the ability to shape stories, careers, and finances. And that's where the foolishness becomes unavoidable. Instead of consolidating that control, Baker bled it dry through reckless spending, unmanaged risk, and a stubborn refusal to accept limits. Money flowed out faster than it came in. Projects ballooned beyond reason. Safeguards were ignored. Friends and collaborators later described a man who believed momentum itself would solve every problem. If something went wrong, he pushed harder. If debts mounted, he gambled bigger. Prudence felt like surrender. What makes this so striking is that Baker understood systems of power better than most. He knew how studios worked. He knew how leverage functioned. He simply assumed he was immune to consequences because he had survived worse before. That assumption was fatal to his empire. Control without restraint became chaos. As finances collapsed, options narrowed. The freedom he had fought for evaporated, replaced by obligation and pressure. Baker, once a kingmaker, found himself scrambling. Not because talent failed him, but because judgment did. The machine he built consumed itself. There's a cruel irony here. Baker wanted independence above all else, and his mismanagement ensured he lost it completely. He didn't fall because of exploitation. He fell because he treated power like bravado instead of responsibility. And if his story is about squandering authority, the next one flips the equation entirely. A man handed one of the most valuable roles in British television history who seemed determined to tear it apart from the inside. 14. Tom Baker. Tom Baker didn't just play a character. He collided with one. When he stepped into the role that would define him, he brought eccentricity, intelligence, and unpredictability in equal measure. Audiences adored him. Producers saw lightning in a bottle. And Baker himself seemed almost offended by how well it was going. From early on, Baker treated authority as an adversary. Scripts were challenged, directions were ignored. Interviews became battlegrounds. He cultivated an image of principled chaos, positioning himself as an artist resisting mediocrity. The trouble is, resistance requires strategy. Baker preferred provocation. Accounts from sets describe a pattern of antagonism that went far beyond creative disagreement. Schedules suffered, relationships frayed. What might have been collaborative tension hardened into open hostility. Baker seemed to believe that the role's importance insulated him from consequences. For a while it did. What makes this foolish rather than merely difficult is Baker's blindness to the scale of what he was risking. This wasn't a disposable job. It was cultural capital of the rarest kind. Instead of nurturing it, he tested its limits repeatedly, as if daring the institution to blink first. Eventually it did. Support waned. Tolerance thinned. Baker's dominance turned into liability. The same unpredictability that once felt electric began to feel exhausting. When the separation came, it wasn't dramatic. It was inevitable. Baker later acknowledged aspects of his behavior with a mix of candor and defensiveness. He framed it as authenticity, as refusal to conform. But authenticity that ignores context becomes self-sabotage. Integrity without diplomacy isolates. His story isn't about rebellion. It's about misunderstanding leverage. Baker had enormous power and used it to burn bridges rather than build protections. And if that seems short-sighted, the next figure shows what happens when impulse isn't intellectual or ideological at all, but compulsive, repeated, destructive, and impossible to disguise. 15. Sid James. Sid James made excess look easy. His laugh, his swagger, his effortless confidence suggested a man permanently in control, permanently amused. Behind that image, however, was a life governed by compulsion rather than choice. A pattern of behavior so entrenched that even looming consequences couldn't interrupt it. James's foolishness was not subtle. It was repetitive. Gambling drained resources faster than success could replenish them. Relationships blurred into chaos. Rest was postponed indefinitely. Advisors warned him. Friends worried. The response was always the same: tomorrow. What makes this especially grim is how visible it was. This wasn't a hidden struggle. It played out in public view, whispered about in dressing rooms, and openly acknowledged in biographies. James seemed aware of the toll, yet incapable or unwilling to alter course. Habits hardened into destiny. Financial pressure mounted. Health suffered. Work became necessity rather than choice. The roles kept coming, but the joy thinned. Laughter turned mechanical. What had once been indulgence became obligation. James wasn't chasing pleasure anymore. He was running from pause. There's something haunting about how little mystery surrounded the outcome. This wasn't a sudden fall. It was a long march, uninterrupted by intervention, because intervention had been attempted too many times. People stopped urging change. They simply watched. James's life forces an uncomfortable recognition. Foolishness doesn't always announce itself as ignorance. Sometimes it's repetition without reflection. Knowing the pattern doesn't break it. Acknowledging the damage doesn't halt it. And when behavior becomes ritual, even success can't interrupt the decline. By the time the curtain fell, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. A man who never stopped moving because stopping meant facing the cost. And from here, the stories grow even heavier. Because the next two figures didn't merely flirt with excess or impulse. They embraced legend, mistook destruction for identity, and carried it with them until it defined everything. 16. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole arrived in cinema like a force of nature, towering presence, lyrical voice, intelligence sharpened by mischief. He wasn't just talented, he was aware of it. And that awareness slowly mutated into a dangerous belief. That excess was not a flaw, but a credential. That chaos wasn't a problem to be solved, but proof that the work was real. O'Toole's foolishness wasn't ignorance. It was mythology. He built a legend around himself and then lived inside it, mistaking endurance for invincibility. Stories of excess followed him everywhere, often retold with a wink, as if damage were just another colorful anecdote. At first, this made him magnetic. Then it made him unreliable. Eventually, it made him costly. What's most striking is how self-aware he was. O'Toole spoke openly about confusing destruction with authenticity. He admitted that he believed suffering deepened art, that discipline dulled it. This philosophy gave him permission to ignore limits long after those limits began demanding attention. Warnings were acknowledged, even eloquently discussed, and then set aside. Projects suffered, trust eroded, directors learned to brace themselves. Studios adjusted expectations downward, not because his talent diminished, but because his volatility couldn't be managed indefinitely. The industry doesn't punish excess immediately, it waits. And when it acts, it does so quietly. Fewer offers, smaller risks, gentler exits. There's a tragedy in how avoidable much of this was. O'Toole didn't lack insight or support. He lacked restraint. He treated survival as victory, rather than asking what was being lost along the way. The body keeps score. So does reputation. Late in life, reflection crept in. The legend softened. The admissions became heavier, less playful. He spoke of misunderstanding himself, of believing that brilliance required sacrifice on an altar that never asked for it. By then, the myth had already done its work. O'Toole's story is a bridge between charm and caution. It shows how easily excess can be romanticized, especially when talent keeps delivering despite the cost. But it also sets the stage for the final, most uncompromising example. Someone who didn't just live the legend, but challenged the world to stop him. And the world, astonishingly, never quite did. 17. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed never drifted into self-destruction. He charged at it, loudly, publicly, with a grin that suggested he considered restraint a personal insult. Where others flirted with excess or rationalized it as philosophy, Reed embraced it as identity. This wasn't behavior spiraling out of control. It was behavior daring control to intervene. Reed was ferociously talented. On screen, he radiated danger, intelligence, and raw physical authority. Directors knew what he could deliver when focused. The problem was that focus became optional. Reed cultivated notoriety as aggressively as he pursued roles, turning provocation into a kind of performance art that spilled far beyond the set. Warnings were constant. Consequences were visible. Reed ignored both. He treated concern as weakness and moderation as betrayal. Stories of confrontations, absences, and chaos piled up, not as cautionary tales but as badges of honor. He didn't deny them. He amplified them. What makes Reed's foolishness the most shocking isn't just the scale, it's the refusal to course-correct even when the cost became undeniable. Opportunities vanished. Insurance became an issue. Reputations hardened. Yet Reed seemed almost energized by resistance, as if opposition validated his worldview. If people wanted him to stop, that alone was reason enough to continue. Unlike others on this list, Reed never pretended to be misunderstood. He understood perfectly. He simply didn't care. That clarity removes ambiguity and leaves something colder behind. Choice. Repeated, informed choice. There's a brutal irony in how his story ends, not as a shocking twist, but as a culmination. The path was visible for years. The warning signs weren't subtle. What shocks isn't the outcome, but how long it took to arrive. Talent bought him time. Charisma bought him forgiveness. The myth bought him applause. None of it bought him escape. Reed leaves behind a final, uncomfortable truth. Genius does not cancel foolishness. Courage does not excuse neglect. And living loudly is not the same as living wisely. Some people don't fall because they don't see the edge. They fall because they stand on it, look down, and decide the risk is the point. And when the noise finally fades, what remains isn't the legend, but the question of how much brilliance the world is willing to lose before it stops clapping.